And now I'd like to take a moment to introduce our speaker. Tonight's speaker is marine biologist Dan Richards, who has been monitoring intertidal sites here at Channel Islands National Park for nearly 30 years. He will be discussing the diversity of marine life at the Channel Islands and examine how organisms adapt to the changing rocky intertidal environment. Please welcome Dan Richards.
Good evening. This is a subject near and dear to my heart. After 30 years, this is one aspect of my job that I still really like. Tide pools, I've always described as kind of a window to the sea. For non-divers, this is one way that they get to experience some of the marine life up close and personal. Another colleague of mine likes to talk about tide pools as a place that people come to fall in love with the sea. And I really like that too. I think this is a great place. I think it's near and dear to a lot of people. Many of us kind of grew up playing in tide pools, and certainly for me, this was one of the ways that I fell in love with the ocean and wanted to become a marine biologist. To me, I really like just the textures and the colors that we find down there, and the diversity of organisms is just unmatched anywhere. I think Sylvia Earle explained this really well one time. She said that, when you go down and you pick up a rock and you find so many different species just on one little rock, and it's not just like what you'd find in, say, a forest where you'd find a couple of plants and maybe half a dozen different species of beetles. We're talking about at least half a dozen different phyla are represented on a rock. I mean, these are organisms that are separated by millions of years of evolution. And, for me, I can still remember as a kid walking down on the beach and picking up red algae and just being totally fascinated by the texture and how stretchy it was and the color and just looking at it, and I think that that was a lot of what drove me to become a marine biologist. Of course, everybody's got their own reasons for why they like to hang out at the beach and so on, but whatever is cool. Recently, I've been working a lot with black abalone, and I was working on the committees to get them listed as an endangered species. We've been working on critical habitat. And it got me thinking about what their range is, and I started thinking, that as far as habitat with black abalone and with a lot of marine intertidal species, anyways, it's almost like a two-dimensional world. If you map this out onto a scale of even just one of the islands, if you actually map the habitat of some of these species, you wouldn't even be able to see the line. You wouldn't be able to draw it that thin. That's just how narrow their range is. Some of the things like some of the sessile organisms, I mean, they're really limited in how broad a range there are, especially on a steep vertical slope like this. Black abalone, as I was mentioning, they're only found within a meter or two of low tide, and they really like a certain rocky habitat and so on. So they're pretty small. Even birds, some of the shorebirds that are down there, like oyster catchers, and we have a black oyster catcher and an American oyster catcher. These birds only fly really within a couple hundred yards of the coast. You never see them out over the water. You never see them inland. They're just on this little narrow strip of shore, and so to me, that's just really something that you got to consider a lot, because it's a very small area. Then of course there's pinnipeds, harbor seals that they're a very coastal species. They haul up onto the rocks in the intertidal, and they feed down out in the kelp forest, but they're right there along the shore. Then you've got other things like the elephant seals that use the intertidal, but they range a little bit farther. These guys, as you probably well know, go out into the mid-Pacific and up into the Bering Sea to feed, and then dive down a mile deep in the water. So they're feeding in deep water. But they come back to the intertidal zone to breed and to rest in the springtime. They molt there. That's where they're protected from their predators, white sharks and things. And this is kind of an interesting aspect, because this is a way of bringing nutrients from out in the mid-ocean and deep sea back to the land, to the intertidal zone. As they defecate on the beach, and they, if they die there, their carcass, feeds the organisms that are living there, and so on. And then that gets transferred to the land as land organisms and birds, land mammals rather, come down and feed on the beach and eat some of the organisms and so on. The other pinniped that's really common in our area, of course, is the California sea lion. And these guys tend to like rocks, where the seals often like the beaches. And one aspect of the sea lions that we've seen is that they're really good climbers, and they can occur in pretty good numbers. And their impacts in the intertidal can be just like humans. They really trample things. This should have all kinds of algae growing in this zone. It should have barnacles and lots of different little snails. But these sea lions drag themselves over this so much, and they defecate in the zone and really increase the nutrients in there. And so, the result is just some of, a few species of green algae in this case are surviving there. Well, typical scientists, we have to classify everything. And, when you start talking about the coastal zone, the typical classification is rock, cobble, and sand. Sandy beaches can then be further classified, for instance, based on their slope and the size of the grains of sand that are on the beach. And there are actually a lot of organisms here. You just can't always see them because they're down in the sand. And one of the interesting things about sandy beaches is because most of those organisms are mobile, because they don't, they can't really attach to anything. So that's the way they live. And so they tend to move up and down with the tide. So they're more within a constant zone of comfort for themselves. I'll get back to that subject in a minute. Cobble is another kind of an interesting habitat. It's actually quite vulnerable to oil spills, because oil will accumulate down in the crevices, and it's really hard to clean out. But this habitat is actually pretty uncommon on the islands, and kind of thankfully so. It's a hard area to work in because the boulders are unstable. The organisms kind of move around a little bit, but not a lot like the sand, and so it's just kind of a difficult place to work. The rocky benches, probably a little bit more what everybody's used to. These can be real variable. If you go up to Washington, say Olympic National Park, the rocky benches there can be almost a half-mile wide in some places. The tide is pretty extreme, and you've got these long, really flat benches, and it's just amazing how wide some of those can be. Maybe not a half mile, but a couple hundred meters anyways. Out at the islands here, they tend to be fairly steady slope. We've excuse me, some areas the rock can be pretty steep, and so you have real narrow bands. Other areas it's spread out a little bit more on these toes like this. But this is your kind of classic rocky intertidal habitat, where you've got many different zones of life. Now, on a nice calm day like this, the The habitat seems like a great place to be, but the organisms here have to be able to adapt to, two completely different worlds. One when they're submerged, and another when they're exposed to the air. On a nice foggy, calm day like this, it might not seem like that big a deal. But, if the sun is shining or the waves are pounding, it can be a completely different sort of habitat. Pounding waves like this really create, some interesting challenges, shall we say, for the organisms to live here. But it can also provide some opportunities for some of the organisms that are well adapted to that. Just how do things hang on in a place like this? This is out at Orizaba Cove. You may not be able to get a good perspective on this, but from the top of the wave down to the bottom where this sucks out, that's probably 20 feet there. It's scary to stand next to this. It's like Niagara Falls going off there. There's so much water, and it all changes in about 10 seconds, in and out. So just, how can things withstand that kind of pressure and speed and stress? We've got 3/8 inch bolts, stainless steel bolts out in the intertidal that are bent at 90-degree angles. That's a lot of force to bend something like that. For organisms like you and me, this is certainly not a very habitable place. But, a lot of things do survive quite well. And that's partly because with this diagram I've stolen from Mimi Cole's book, the Windswept Shores, I'm sorry. You can see that there's this boundary layer right next to the rock, even where the water is really moving fast, right next to the rock may be moving quite slowly. And as you move away from, get into the calmer water, that boundary layer increases a little bit, and larger organisms can live there without those same impacts. And she describes how small anemones, low flat ones like these Anthopleura elegantissima, might be subject to only 10% of the wave force that their neighbors in the center of the channel and sticking up a little bit more might be exposed to. So large anemones like this can have easily 10 times more water force on them as a wave goes out of this surge channel. But a lot of these organisms are really good at using the microtopography and moving into crevices so that they're protected a little bit from the waves. Things like anemones can also change their shape. So, if things get rough, they can actually kind of flatten themselves out a little bit and take advantage of that. Organisms like this palm kelp, the laminaria, can be subject to 100 times the amount of wave stress that the flat algae up against the rock there would be. This coralline algae just kind of lays right flat up against the rock, and so really nothing can peel it off. But the kelps have the ability to kind of bend and flex with the waves. But this that boundary layer that I was talking about can also work against organisms in fairly calm water. So this macrocystis, for instance, is excuse me, more developed for kind of calmer conditions. And if you look at the kelp here and this nice, smooth, shiny blade, what happens sometimes if the water is too calm is they don't get refreshment of the nutrients and the oxygen that's in the water. It builds up this little kind of stagnant layer against the blade. And if I can get that back. But the crenulations and even the bulb on these kelp plants will cause turbulence as the water, even just a light flow, goes over the plant. And so the water right next to the the cells that do the exchange of nutrients and so on get fresh water all the time. Other ways of dealing with the wave stress and other things is you can really strengthen your cell walls. Like this coralline algae, they use calcium in the cell walls. Now that also has an added benefit that it makes them pretty unpalatable to herbivores. Another kind of adaptation of the coralline algae like this is just kind of this low, dense clump. And that also sort of protects them and deflects some of the water that would go over them. Another extreme of dealing with waves is what this mammalian has done, this red algae here. These are just like spaghetti noodles, and they just completely go with the flow. They're real stretchy, and so there really isn't that much wave force on them. Another way of doing it is to get down close to the rock. This is Ralphsia. This is a brown algae that just lies flat on the rock. This one is Pseudolithoderma nigra, also called the tar spot algae. And this one really goes to the extreme that it's only a couple cells thick. It actually looks like it's just been painted on the rock. It's so flat. You can see the texture of the rock right in there. Half the time, I even have trouble telling sometimes whether these are actually just discoloration in the rock or if it's the actual algae. No, that was just the algae. Yeah, there's a wet spot there. You can see this really black here is just where the water has run down and is made it black. This other is dry. Animals also have adaptations in their shape and where they live to deal with wave stress. Barnacles have, oops, wrong button. Sorry. Barnacles have these little ridges that help deflect some of the water off of them. They have this kind of buttressed structure around the base to make them really strong, and then they just have incredible glue that they're really stuck onto the rock with. These little snails, littorine snails, use the barnacles and other microtopography of the rock to hide down in the crevices, so they really get down in there so that when the waves hit, they're within that boundary layer so that they're protected. Other animals have this nice shape where they're kind of flattened and tapered at the edges, and this chitin, cryptochitin, or not cryptochitin, Cyanoplex dentigira, is a good example of that. Nice, low, flat, deflects the water, and not any particular direction. Most of these are radially kind of shaped, so that they can. They don't have to be facing one direction into the waves, is what I'm trying to say, I guess. And as organisms get bigger, the drag that increases a lot on their bodies, and so things like this small limpet can avoid some of that drag. But again, these have that tapered shape to them, and tapered off to the edges and low. Slightly bigger organisms here, the sea stars and the mussels. They've also kind of got shapes that are fairly hydrodynamic. Sea stars use tube feet, though, that they can really adhere to the rock and still move around. Mussels adhere to the rock with byssal threads. Whoops. These byssal threads up here, you can just sort of see them. They're little fibers that the mussel itself produces, and they put out just dozens of these that they glue to the rock and are glued to the shell, and they're just amazing at how well they can hold in there. And where they live in really rough water, they put out lots of them. Where they're not in rough water, they don't have so many. And they've also kind of got a little bit of a tapered body shape to them, and in really rough seas, you'll see that the shells are all pretty well lined up with the dominant wave action. In a lot of our areas where it's more confused and maybe not, such heavy waves, they may not be lined up in the same direction. Mussels themselves, they have those adaptations of hanging on with the abyssal threads. But as a group, as a whole bed here, they actually have it it sort of forms their own little adaptation in that this nice flat bed becomes kind of a superorganism that deflects the waves a little bit more. If you get openings like you get here where the sea stars are starting to eat them, these mussels along the edge then are a lot more vulnerable to the waves than they would be in the middle of this bed. This habitat modification also works for a lot of other organisms, in that there's a lot of space in between these mussels, and you find incredible diversity of snails and worms and various things in amongst the mussels, where they would not be able to survive really on their own. They'd be open and vulnerable to predators, but they wouldn't be able to survive in the waves either necessarily. Now, a lot of things grow on top of other things, and in this case we've got barnacles and algae growing on top of these mussel shells. That adds and increases the drag that those mussel shells are adapted to. So they have to either add more abyssal threads, or they'll be vulnerable themselves to being torn out because of that. And in fact, that often happens, that you just get too much growth on some of these things, and they just can't support that drag anymore, and they'll get torn out in storms, and that's how we get these openings. And it creates this nice mosaic, actually, that where new things can move into those habitats that might have been dominated before. Well, there's in addition to waves, there's a lot of things that change within the environment here. And this is a shot from our monitoring site at Johnson's Lee. And keep an eye on this. Look at the top of this rock here. And this is one of the changes that we can see here. This is the top of that same rock right here. You can see that there's a couple of feet of sand just over this tide pool. What you don't see to the right is that there's actually about 3 or 4 feet of sand covering some of that rock out there. So organisms, may have to withstand, being buried by sand or something for, days or weeks, or in some cases even months, as the sand changes throughout the year. Some organisms are pretty well adapted to this. This is Zonaria farloii, this brown algae that's here. And there was a study back in the 70s that showed that Zonaria was actually able to survive sand burial for up to 6 months or so. They can continue to photosynthesize in there, and they can withstand the often anoxic conditions. Now, for some of the animals, that's a little bit harder, but often the animals in these kind of conditions, are able to move. They don't settle there if they're stuck, like some of the barnacles, or else they either just have to put up with it or die. Even the rock itself changes. This is one of our marker bolts here that was put out in 1985. I don't remember exactly when this picture was taken, probably about 20 years later at least. And you can see that there's at least an inch of rock that has disappeared underneath this rock, underneath this bolt. The hard epoxy can withstand the sand abrasion and so on, and even this silicon bronze bolt has just about worn out. But that's just so things are constantly changing out there. Organisms out there, they're used to living under the sea and in salt conditions and so on. But when they're exposed to the air, they're exposed to whatever the air brings with it. And This is one of our lovely days at Crook Point. We're often standing in the rain waiting for it to let up a little bit so we can finish our monitoring. It's unpleasant for us, but that heavy rain can be toxic or lethal, anyways, to some of the organisms that live there. They just can't. They have to be able to tolerate extremes of osmotic changes. The other thing can happen too, where you've got some of these high tide pools. They may fill up with water at a high tide, but then over the next couple of weeks, they may not get much water. And if it's hot and sunny, the water can evaporate, and the pool ends up being really hypersaline. And so they have to deal with anywhere from fresh water to, maybe 100 parts per thousand, where normal seawater is only 30 parts per thousand salt. They also have to deal with desiccation. Oops, didn't mean to do that. This is porphyra, also called nori. It's a red algae. It's very thin, and this algae is very well adapted to this high intertidal and can tolerate being dried out. And in fact, studies have shown that they actually photosynthesize a little bit better when they're in their dry state than when they're covered with water. Things like cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, they actually can live down in the interstices of the rock itself, and that's one way they kind of survive. And when they really dry out, they actually kind of go into a dormant stage, and it's almost like hibernation for them. And then they can immediately change as soon as they start getting wet again. But if you're out walking in the intertidal, this is something you got to watch out for, because when it's dry, this black rock is easy to walk on, but when it's wet and those algae are kind of up and swelled up, it is like black ice. And I've seen a lot of people go down really fast and hard, including myself. Another algae, this is rockweed, Hesperophycus. Some of these live fairly high in the intertidal, and they're pretty well adapted to being dried out too. And in fact, this one can get so dry. I've seen it so dry, it's like potato chips, or just brittle almost. But as soon as they get wet, almost immediately they go back to normal and function properly. So they're just adapted to living there. But sometimes conditions get fairly extreme. One of the things we get here is that we get Santa Anas in the wintertime when we have our low tides during the daytime. We actually get some of our nicest, warmest weather out along the coast in the wintertime, which corresponds to a lot of these low tides. And sometimes, especially with the dry Santa Ana winds, it's just a little too much for some of the algae. But these may not necessarily be, oops, keep hitting the wrong button. These may not be killed. They often, the pigments within their tissues may degrade and be released, but the plant itself is able to continue to survive and will continue to grow. And as soon as conditions get back to better, they will produce more pigments and be able to continue to photosynthesize and so on. But it kind of brings up a point that just a small change, just let's say a foot of sea level change, can mean hours of difference on most of the tides that we have. And all the different organisms have different tolerance levels to that. And that's why you get this zonation, where one organism may be up here, and we've got mussels in this case, and turfweed down here, and different algae as we go down. And kind of the classic theory of intertidal zonation, of course there's exceptions to everything, but the classic is that the upper boundaries are determined by these physical forces. You know, what is it able to tolerate? How much heat, how much dryness can it take? The lower boundaries, on the other hand, are often dictated by predation and competition. And this example, the sunflower star, these guys don't really like to dry out very much. You find them kind of in the low intertidal sometimes, but they usually are coming up from the depths to feed on mussels and things in the intertidal. But they can't stay there. And so they can only go so far. And so for some of the organisms that can tolerate a little bit more warmth and dryness, you know, they can get up kind of out of the range of some of these predators. But of course, you know, there are predators from the top down too. Things like the shorebirds. We also see mice and fox often go down to the intertidal and feed. Of course, these guys have to sit around and wait during high tide for the tide to go back out. And they're probably not real significant predators compared to some of the marine creatures like the starfish. But you know, some of the shorebirds, like oyster catchers especially, eat quite a few limpets and snails and things. And then, of course, during high tide, you've got some of these other marine creatures that come up. This is a leopard shark that is coming up into the shallows during high tide to feed. These often feed on the crabs and things that are up in there. Another fish that we typically find up in the intertidal might be this cabezon. I've seen some pretty good sized cabezon stranded during high tide in the tide pools. And these guys will eat crabs and various snails, and they love abalone. Another predator that comes from the deep that nobody really thought about until just a couple of decades ago is the lobster. Carlos Robles from Cal State Long Beach, or Cal State LA, set up some cameras in the intertidal zone. He bolted them down to the rock, and they took time-lapse pictures all day and all night. And it was really interesting to see those pictures because at night especially, lots of lobsters were coming up into the intertidal and feeding on the mussels and feeding on some of the other organisms that were there. And they really had no clue that they were this much of a predator in the shallows. And then you've got some of the resident predators like Pizester ocracius, the ochre star. And these guys can become really abundant and just will wipe out a mussel bed. This was all mussels, and they're just kind of moving along, just mowing them down. During the 80s, when I first started working here, Pizester were really pretty rare out at the islands. That was because the 83 El Nino hit, and with that warm water came a disease, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But it just about wiped out the population, and then it wasn't until the mid 90s that we really started to see them come back, and then in some places they've come back in just in huge numbers. As I mentioned, Pizester move about using their tube feet. These little extensions here, you're probably all pretty well familiar with that. Little suckers on the end of it. This is hydraulically driven, and they can put a lot of pressure with those tube feet, and they use it to pry open the mussel shells. All they need to do is just pry it open just a little bit, get a little gap in there, and then they invert their stomach out through their mouth and into the mussel shell, where they can dissolve the mussel in place, and then and absorb the nutrients. The only trouble with this hydraulic system is that they need water to be able to function with that. And so if they're up too high and they dry out too much, then they lose their strength. They can't move around. They can't pull the muscles apart. So they have to wait for the water to come back in. Mussels can kind of combat things, mussels and other organisms as well, by growing. You know, they get too big for some of the predators. It's kind of a refuge, but you know, sea stars are. We've seen some pretty good-sized sea stars as well. So, you know, it's just sort of a one-upsmanship. You know. Then there are lots of little predators. This is one you probably don't see very often. This is a centipede that lives down in the intertidal, and these guys roam around, probably feeding mostly on mites and little isopods and things. Just coincidence, they happen to be the same shape in the pictures here, but this is a completely different organism. This is Nemertean, a ribbon worm. These guys are a whole other phylum, and they're predators as well. They feed on small organisms again. They've got a proboscis that extends out. And Nemerteans are just kind of cool. They're actually able to stretch, and people have found these guys that have been many meters long down there. And you just find them winding all through the rock and in and out. Just another one of the little cool creatures that are out there. Okay, sometimes when we get predators, you know, numbers build up, and as I mentioned before, it kind of creates this mosaic system where you've got openings in the rock, and so, you know, new things can recruit in and so on. But sometimes when organisms are really abundant, they sort of cause problems for themselves, and one of the things can be in disease transmission. I don't know how much that is an issue in the marine environment, because you know they're often bathed in that, but sometimes some of these things have to be direct transmission. But you probably have seen it in the tide pool here at the visitor center. We see it out at the islands a lot. Whenever the water gets above 62 degrees or so, this bacterial infection hits them. We call it sea star wasting disease. And it just kind of causes them to just rot. It's kind of like leprosy or something, I don't know. But if the conditions change and it gets really cold really fast before they get too far along, they actually can heal themselves. But this one obviously is pretty far gone. Another bacterial infection. This is probably also, it's a related species of bacteria, we think. None of these diseases have really been studied very well. This is certainly something that's open for a lot of study for anybody looking for projects. Yeah, but anyways, sea urchins are also affected, we think, by this Vibrio type of bacteria. And in mild cases, they start to lose their spines. In more advanced cases, you'll see lesions on the shell where the test will actually start to kind of rot away, and you get these big open kind of wounds. But again, if things don't progress too far and the water cools down again, the bacteria goes into remission and the animal can survive. We've actually seen sea urchins out there with little short, look like they have a buzz cut, little short spines all over, And plants aren't immune to disease also, or either. This is one of the rockweeds, Helvetia, out there. And we've been seeing this black thallus a couple of times, or over the last few years, rather. I haven't really been able to get a good answer on this thing. It may be a fungal infection. It may also just be a stress effect of too much light, causing degradation of the tissue from too much UV light. We don't really know, but we do know that fungal infections do affect some of the algae. And then you're probably also familiar with the bacterial infection that just about wiped out abalone in Southern California. We lost 99% of the abalone at the islands due to this wasting, this we call it withering syndrome, because what happens is this bacteria gets into their gut, and it prevents them from absorbing nutrients somehow. And so the animal ends up just shrinking because it's starving to death. And we'll find, you know, a normal abalone would completely fill this shell. And we'll find, I've seen abalone that were half the size of this foot here. The muscle tissue has shrunk down so much, but they were still hanging on there somehow. But eventually get to the point where they can't even hang on to the rock, and they're some more subject to predation and wave of impacts. But recently we've been seeing a lot of recruitment at least at a few of our sites, a few of the islands. A study that was done at San Nicolas Island where they tested some of the abalone from there by exposing them to the bacterial infectant agent. And they definitely seem to be more resistant, which is, you know, what we'd expect. So that was one reason we pushed for closing the fishery in the 80s and early 90s, so that if any of them did survive, which they did, hopefully they would be resistant to the bacteria and be able to rejuvenate the population. And that may be what we're indeed seeing now. When I started working here in the early 80s, black abalone were one of the dominant organisms in the intertidal. And it's just, you know, except for a few places now, you just don't see them that often. Another abalone that we do see up in the intertidal sometimes is the red abalone. Most of the time we see little bitty guys, little recruits. They'll live up in the intertidal where they may be safer from things like cabezon. But occasionally we'll find a big guy like this one. This would be a legal abalone up in Northern California. And this was, you know, where the Chumash would often find them and harvest these guys. Another abalone that likes shallow water is the green abalone. These guys live in very shallow water. But, you know, to tell you the truth, I rarely ever see them exposed. So I think that they're mostly below low tide, but again, they're quite shallow. Abalone are a favorite food item of a lot of different organisms, not just us. As I mentioned, cabezon like to eat them. Starfish will eat them. Crabs is probably what got this guy. You can see the chips in the shell here. So it's just sort of typical, you know, when you're a grazer, that's often what, you know, it's kind of like the buffalo. I mean, everybody wants to eat them, right? And I say that they're grazers. Actually, when they're juveniles, they probably graze on microalgae on the rock. But the adults tend to just kind of hang on, and they're up in the high intertidal, and they tend to catch drift algae coming in. The macrocystis that gets torn out of the kelp forest, washes up onto the rocks, and they will very eagerly grab it, hold on to it, and munch away. Owl limpets, the giant owl limpet, this is Laudia gigantea, are a little bit different. They don't. They tend to be grazers on the rock. Owl limpets are sequential hermaphrodites. Abalone are you know, they have males and females. Owl limpets start as males, and then at some point in their life they change to female. And so all the big limpets that we see out there are all females. And as I mentioned, these guys just graze on the microalgae on the rock. They just kind of go along licking the rock with their radula. It's kind of a rasp-like tongue that they have. And you can see these little lick marks up and down the rock. And I think it's really pretty fascinating. Get some really neat textures and patterns that they'll produce. And owl limpets are notorious for having their little home range. They're farmers. They're not out hunting everywhere. They like to cultivate their little patch of diatoms. And they'll do that by going through and kind of bulldozing everything else off the rock, barnacles, algae, limpets, whatever they can, you know. Some of these small limpets, I think, probably just move out of the way whenever they see them coming in, and so they're able to kind of hang in there. There's some really neat video you might be able to find on YouTube where they've done time lapse of interaction between different Lotia, where they come and fight each other, and you know, it's kind of fun. But anyways, you can see the home range where this one has cleared out the space, and they tend to, you know, have just enough area that they need, and you'll find them kind of sharing the rock in some areas. You find a lot higher density and probably smaller home ranges on the islands than you do on the mainland, and I don't really know why that is. Maybe it's just more productive. A lot of these little home spots, you'll see what we call home scars within that territory, and that's where the limpet tends to go every night, and they go back to the same spot, and eventually they just kind of wear down a spot in the rock, and they can actually settle down in that and kind of protects them a little bit more, because now the edge of their shell is down under the rock, and it's harder for an oyster catcher or something to get their beak under it to prime up. As I mentioned, they share with some of these other limpets. They usually will try and push them out, but you know, in some cases, these guys will just live on the shell of the owl limpet and just graze the algae that's there. Another large limpet that we find out at the islands is the file limpet. This one's called Lotia limatula, and these can get up couple inches long. I might mention that the giant owl limpets, Lotia gigantea, can get up over 5 inches long on the islands. On the mainland, it's unusual really to find them much bigger than about half that size, and that's because some people will eat them, and so there's just, you know, a lot more pressure on them on the mainland. I don't know what the story is on these Lotia limatula. They weren't very common in the 80s and early 90s, certainly. Now they seem to be much more common. They're more abundant, and but like I said, I really don't know much about where they're coming from. Another limpet. These are more of an older form, evolutionary-wise. The volcano limpet, this hole on the top of their shell is where they excrete some of their waste products and you know, the water that they've filtered through. These tend to be pretty common, but they're down in the mussels often, a little bit lower in the intertidal, and so we just don't run into them very often. But you do find a lot of the shells sometimes on certain beaches where you find a lot of shell accumulation. Chitons usually lick the rocks just like chitons, or just like limpets rather, and they're a more primitive form of gastropod. They've got these plated shells. There's eight plates that they have, and then this girdle around them. And most of these, again, are herbivores, but there is one species that gets down into our area a little bit. It's more common in Northern California, called Placiferella, that is a carnivore. It kind of lifts up one end a little bit and sort of sits on the rock like this, and when amphipods or other small animals will come creep along, if they bump into it, it'll slam down really fast, just kind of like a Venus flytrap, and catch it and eat them. This is the cup and saucer limpet, Trimusculus reticulatus. This is probably something that's only of interest to nerds like me. It's just something you just don't run into very often. They tend to be under rocks and kind of hard to find. But it's kind of neat because it's a filter feeder. It casts a little mucus net that it catches plankton and debris bits on, and then processes that food. Another common predator, this guy who eventually grew up to be quite a voracious predator, is the octopus, of course. And I think you guys are probably all pretty well acquainted with the intelligence that these guys are well known to have. But one of the interesting things about them is that they're really short-lived. Most of them only live a year or two at the most. In contrast, some of the snails may live 10, 20, 30 years. This is the turban snail, black turban snail, Tegula funebralis, or now Chlorostoma funebralis. You can see it's been around a while. The shell is eroded so much, it's just got this little point up here now. Another organism that lives a long time are the sea anemones. These guys have been known to live 70 or 80 years in aquaria. They kind of cheat because one of the ways they can reproduce is by dividing themselves. I'm not sure if this guy is actually dividing in the process or not, but they'll actually kind of pull themselves away and they'll split in two. One of the questions that I often get the most when we're walking around the intertidal is, how come some of these guys are so bright? What's the difference in the color? And as far as we can tell, it's just a matter of a different strain of zooxanthellae that they have. They have algae in their tissues, just like coral do, and probably about 1 or 2% have this really bright color. Might even be the same species of algae, just a different strain. But anyways, that seems to be all it is. We've got several different species of anemone that occur down here. This is the giant green anemone. This one's a little more common north of us. We find it out at San Miguel and Santa Rosa Island a lot. And you can tell these guys, because they don't have stripes in the face. The column of along the base is pretty clean. They don't hold on to a lot of shells and stuff like these guys do. And this is Anthoplura xanthogrammica. The most common large green anemone that we have down here is probably Anthoplura sola. These guys used to be part of what's considered Anthoplura elegantissima, which I'll show you in a second. But recently, just in the last 15 years or so, they did some genetic work and discovered that these were actually separate species. But you can see the nice striping that these guys have on their face, and as I mentioned, they tend to hold on to shells a lot on their column. This is Anthoplura elegantissima. These guys will split and clone very readily, and they form these large masses of sea anemones. And sea anemones in general, they'll tolerate their clone because obviously it was part of them, but they don't have much tolerance for their neighbors from a different genetic stock, and they actually have specialized tentacles just for fighting other anemones. It's called a concha, that they shoot little barbs into the neighbor to make them withdraw and pull back, and anemones can actually move a little bit. It's a very slow process, but they're not stuck onto the rock. They just kind of suction onto the rock, and so they can actually kind of creep along a little bit, and so they'll eventually move apart a little bit. And with the elegantissima, you can actually see some of these lines where the two clones will meet, where they'll leave a little bit of a gap so that they're not touching each other. It's the same species, it's just different clone. The elegantissima are also very good at holding on to little shell bits and accumulating the sand around them. And a lot of times I've seen a lot of people And I think I've probably done it several times myself, where you think you're sitting down on a nice little sandy patch that is going to be fairly dry and comfortable, and you realize all of a sudden that you are completely soaked, because these guys can hold a lot of water. And if you sit on them or step on them, they suddenly release it, and you are completely wet. Another neat little anemone, this one is Epiactis prolifera. I call it the pajama stripe. But they've got kind of a neat little habit. They form little buds, little small babies that sit down in this little pouch along the edge of the column until they grow up a little bit bigger and can survive on their own a little bit. So when you look at these guys, you'll often see 15 or 20 anemones all together there. Some of the other organisms we have down there, of course, the lion shore crab. These guys feed mostly on detritus, but they're also capable of filter feeding. They have special little appendages in their mouth that they're able to filter particles out of the water. They have a cousin, Hemigrapsis nudus, that isn't as common out at the islands. These guys like a little more quieter water, more bays. These will often be found in those cobble fields that we talked about. But anyways, just kind of a different, slightly different. You can see the spots on the arms instead of stripes. There's a couple other differences. One of the ways that I learned to tell these from Pachygrapsis when I was taking taxonomy the first time was that Hemigrapsis don't pinch nearly as much as Pachygrapsis do. So these guys you can hold, and they're pretty amenable, but the Pachygrapsis will almost always pinch you, and they hurt. This one, I know it's a little hard to see, but this is called the porcelain crab, Petrolysses. And these guys tend to live underneath some of the rocks where they're pretty well protected. They're called porcelain crabs because they will very readily drop an arm, just like a lizard will drop its tail to confuse a predator. And the claw will actually kind of continue to snap sometimes, in some cases, while they make their escape. Another crab is the kelp crab. These guys are more common in the subtidal, but you find them up in the intertidal sometimes. They're very cryptic, and so they're probably a lot more common than we often think they are. Rock crabs, this one is Cancer antenarius. This is the common intertidal rock crab. And these guys can get pretty good sized, and they're a voracious predator also, but a lot of things also love to eat crabs. And so more often than not, you'll find these guys, at least at low tide, buried down in the sand or really tucked under rocks. Hermit crabs, of course, they depend on the shells that are out there. And so they're always constantly checking, looking for new homes, seeing if it's a little bit better than what they've got. But they're mostly just little detritivores, picking on little things. This is a decorator crab. These guys have these little hairs all over their carapace. And yeah, it's just like Velcro. And they will pick up little bits of sponge and tunicates and hydroids and stick them onto their shell. And and those hairs will hold it in place until they start to kind of grow there and really camouflages them. Related to the crabs, occasionally we'll find sea spiders. This was really unusual that we found this many. Just a couple of years ago I found this. But these guys, pretty innocuous. They're only about 1/2 inch long, but they're actually little parasites. They have a little sucking mouth part, and they go around picking on other invertebrates. And then we've got things like fish. There are several species of fish that live just in the intertidal. And these guys are adapted to being out of the water for several hours in many cases. A lot of times they'll be in the algae. This is the rockweed gunnel. Here's his head here. And they live underneath the rockweeds, the Sylvicia and Hesperophycus. rockweed gunnel. Yeah. Yeah, they're similar to an eel. They're prickleback, they call them. Yeah, monkey-faced eel is actually a prickleback. And we find juveniles of the monkey-faced eel in the intertidal all the time. You find them under rocks. But they do get quite large, as you are probably aware. And then we get things in the pools. The pools are nice little nursery grounds for some of the fish, like these are shiner surf perch in this case, but juvenile half moons, not half moons, but juvenile gyrella, the opali, and zebra perch are very common in the intertidal pools. And you get things like this little crevice kelpfish. Occasionally, they'll get thrown up by a wave, or the level in a pool will drop a little quicker than they were expecting, and they'll be stranded. But most of these can survive for quite a long time, as long as they're in some wet algae and they're not disturbed too much. Of course, they don't have a lot of mobility here, and they have to be able to avoid predation while they're in that state. One of my favorites is the clingfish. This is Gobisox meandricus. I love the name too. And these guys, their pectoral fins are modified into a little sucker, and they're actually able to hold on to the rocks in some pretty amazing currents. But you'll often find them underneath the rocks. And this guy, typical 2 inches, but they get up to about 4 inches in some cases. Another one that I love to find is the blind goby. These guys, they're almost always found, or pretty much always found, in pairs, and they live in the burrow with these ghost shrimp. They have this symbiotic relationship where they all live together, and they're in a little burrow under the rocks. Pretty cool. But they're completely blind, and they depend on the ghost shrimp for predator detection and things like that. This is the sea hare. These guys are related to nudibranchs, but they have an internal shell, a very thin, papery internal shell. But they just go along mowing down the grass and seaweed. But they can get pretty good sized. And another interesting thing about sea hares is that if you disturb them, if you accidentally step on one, they release this purple ink, deep purple ink that, much like an octopus would, kind of a defense mechanism. But that comes from some of the algae, the red algae that they eat. Another nudibranch that we found, that we find sometimes, is this Hopkinsia rosacea. This one seems to be an intertidal specialist. It's something I've hardly ever seen this thing subtidally. It's just up in the tide pools. And it's just a really beautiful nudibranch. I don't really know too much about it. A lot of these, there really isn't a whole lot of understanding of what they feed on and so on. But Hopkinsia? Actually, they may have changed the name on that one, but I still call it Hopkinsia. That's what everybody knows it by. This one's a little more uncommon in the intertidal. This one is Triopha, just something we find occasionally. Hermescinda crassicornis, you guys may know this one. These guys feed on hydroids, and they're able to take the unfired stinging cells from the hydroid, pass it through their system, and up into these serrata, where it sits there and becomes a defense mechanism for the nudibranch now. So if somebody tries to bite it gets stung with these stinging hydroid cells. Now this is something you may have seen. You know what makes these holes in the rock? This is kind of typical in some of the Monterey shale that we find here. Yeah, this is the pittock or pholads. These are little boring clams that live. They don't like to be up on the beach. These guys are dead now, but they release a mild acid that helps wear down the rock, and then the action of the shell They're actually, their foot goes out, and they kind of use their shell as a drill and ramrod to create these holes. And if you look at the holes, they're actually tapered. And the small end is where they started out, and as they grow, they keep making a bigger and bigger hole. But they can never leave. They keep going deeper into the rock. But what happens with this Monterey Shale is it often splits off and will break away and wash up on the beach, and then they're stuck. What? Yeah, it is. It's got ridges like a file. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of organisms on the beach. They live down in the sand, though, for the most part. These burrows are from the beach hoppers, and these guys are responsible for cleaning your beaches. Otherwise we'd be up to our necks in washed up kelp. Some of the other interesting organisms that are down on the beach. This is the tiger beetle, family Cincindelidae. These guys are really cool. They've got big, nasty mouth parts that they're really voracious predators. They're very fast. They have very good eyesight, and they're just all over the place. And it's kind of an interesting insect. These are actually there are several species that are on the endangered species list because they tend to be kind of endemic in a lot of places. These are out at the marsh on Santa Rosa Island, and we see them down on the beach there. This is Alaniscus. This is one of the little isopods that lives down on the beach. This is kind of in between some of the marine isopods that we typically see, like Excerolana or something, and the pill bugs that we would see up in the higher terrestrial environment. This is the rove beetle. This is family Staphylinid. These guys are also voracious predators. They're down there feeding on the beach hoppers. And then you get little things like these mites. We find them on the beach, but we also probably more often find them in the rocky intertidal. But they're actually fairly common. Another isopod is the rock louse, Ligia. And these guys are kind of neat because they have, they brood their young and their eggs, so they carry them around with them. And so as a result, they don't really have a lot of dispersal from one area to another. And so geneticists have been doing some work on these guys to look at the biogeography. I'll just throw in a couple of quick plants here. This is the dune Abronia maritima. Sea rocket, you're probably all familiar with, but this is a kind of a cool plant because it's got these four-parted seed capsule, and the outer two parts of the capsule will break away and float off in the sea, and they can colonize new areas. The little basal part of the rocket stays with the parent plant, and the seed will fall down where the parent was and reseed where that known good habitat was. So it's pretty clever strategy, I think. Another intertidal plant is pickleweed, Salicornia. This is more common in marshes, but we find it sometimes on the islands where you get a lot of salt spray coming up on the beach. Another green plant that's down in the intertidal is the surfgrass, Phyllospatix. These are actually true flowering plants. We have two species. Phyllospatix torii has this real narrow blade, and the flowers are out on the tips, or towards the end of the blades. Phyllospatix schooleri has a wider blade and a little thinner, a little more grass-like, and the flowers are down near the base, right down near the rhizome. They have some algae that grows pretty specifically on them. This is Smithora. I'm going to run through these, running a little over time here. Other epiphytes are pretty specific to their host plant as well. This is Soranthera ovoidea that's living on Neorotomella. I think it's kind of a cool plant. As far as I know, the Soranthera only grows on the Neorotomella, and both of these are supposed to be north of Point Conception. They're not supposed to be down here, but they're all over the north side of Santa Rosa Island. Another epiphyte pair is this Erythrocystis saccata that grows on some of the Laurencia plants. I just threw this in to talk about some of the different shapes of algae that we find. There's a very complex life cycle, especially among the red algae. And we get haploid and diploid plants. And you can actually get this phase where this is the carposporophyte for the Mastocarpus. And for a long time, they considered these a separate species. And then till the 70s, a couple of people up at UC Berkeley started growing these out to see what they, they had suspicions, and they grew them up, and eventually they were able to produce the other alternate phases of the life cycle, and so they were able to connect them and find out that they were all one species. This one is Chetomorpha. It's a little thin algae, but it's kind of a neat one to study because you can actually see the cell walls, the individual cells, with your naked eye. They're just that big. This one is up in the high tide pools. This is Laurencia. Name has been changed recently to Osmundia. But it's better known as pepperweed. If you've ever found this one and take a little bite of it, I don't recommend taking a big bite of it. Take a little bite, and it's got a really pungent, peppery taste to it. And that just, it's just one of the chemical warfare that some of these algae use to ward off herbivores, predators on them. A common algae right down at the low tide line is Egregia. The juvenile look like lasagna noodles, but the adult plant you know probably as feather boa kelp. These can be 20 or even 30 feet long, and they can actually have a couple of different sort of morphologies depending on whether it's growing in calm or rough conditions. And for a while, they thought that those were different species. Bright green algae that we see down there is ulva, the sea lettuce. This stuff is actually edible. It's a weedy species. It grows really fast. It's kind of given up trying to ward off herbivores by having calcium or chemical warfare. It just grows really fast, so it doesn't need those kinds of things. And rockweeds, as I mentioned, we have two species down here. We have Hesperophycus and Sylvicia. And these are, are kind of habitat modifiers too, because there's a lot of things that live underneath these. They hold a lot of water during low tide. And so snails and limpets and crabs can live underneath those that they wouldn't have been able to survive elsewhere. These inflated tips that actually both these species have, the reproductive structures are within those tips, and during the high tide, they float up, and that may help with spore dispersal. This is dead man's fingers, Codium fragile. I'll just kind of skip over that a little bit. This is one of the coralline algae. This one is just kind of unique in the texture and the rugosity that it has. But it sort of forms a little reef. And some of these some of the worms that are out there do too. These also use calcium to build their tube walls up and actually kind of start to enlarge the reef a little bit, sort of like a coral reef would be. This one is actually a snail. This is Serpulorbis. It looks like a worm, but it's actually a snail. And these guys feed by casting out this mucus net that they catch particles on. This is the sandcastle worm, Phragmatopoma. These guys build these long tubes by grabbing sand grains and mixing it with saliva and gluing it together. And they can grow really fast and replace where they've been broken off and so on. But they, as I mentioned, they can grow really fast. They just, almost overnight, it seems like some places, they form these huge colonies. And you can see some of these anemones that have been trapped in the middle of all this stuff, and they've managed to stretch themselves up and get way up in there. Another little worm is Spirorbis. These guys are only about 1/4 of an inch long. These live up in the high tide pools. Sponges are also filter feeders. And I just, one of the things that's kind of cool about sponges that I just learned recently was somebody did an experiment. They took a sponge and they threw it in a blender and broke it all up into individual cells. And then they dumped it all back into an aquarium and just kind of let it sit for a while. And after a couple of weeks, all the cells had reconstituted basically back into the same exact structure and shape that it was originally. Another sponge, this is Speciospongia. It's not very beautiful. May not even recognize it as a living organism because it just looks like mud and it's got all this algae growing on its cells. But they can actually form these big, huge colonies underwater. Kelp flies. Everybody loves these guys. There's actually several species of kelp flies around. These little bitty guys down here are actually a little wasp, and these guys are pretty common. This is Acanthina, the spotted unicorn, they call it. And they use this tooth on the bottom of the shell to sit on top of a barnacle. And when the barnacle starts to open those plates up, opens his little garage doors, so to speak, to feed, they jam that tooth down in there and block the doors, and then they stick their proboscis down in there and eat the poor barnacle. Another common predatory snail down in the intertidal. These guys are only about 1 inch long, just Acanthina on these guys. Here it is laying its little vase-shaped shells, or egg cases rather. But these are Nucella. These are the dog whelk. These are all the same species. It's just some of the variety of colors and even shapes that we see. And these are some of the byssal threads from the mussels that have been attached to these guys. And I suspect that mussels end up probably killing quite a few of these guys because these are down in the mussel beds. And if enough of the byssal threads get on them, then the snail can't move anymore. And they're trapped there, and eventually they'll starve to death if they can't reach around and eat the mussel. But they feed typically by boring a small hole with their radula into some of these small snails or even small mussels. I'm just going to kind of skip over some of these because we're getting late here. But this one's a fun one. This is Crepidula. This one also is a filter feeder. And these guys are sequential hermaphrodites like the giant owl limpet, and you'll often find males living on top of the female shell there so that they're all nice and close to each other. So anyways, I just want to go on to say that, I hope that you guys appreciate some of the small things that are out there. And I've had a great time working here, doing the intertidal monitoring, working with great people and great creatures. And sometimes you just have to stop and sort of just enjoy the aesthetics of where you are, enjoy the abstracts, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. If anyone has any questions now, we can do a question and answer session, and I'll come around to you. All right.
Hi. The Olivia shell that we know that the Shumash used
Yeah.
so much, is that, which one was that?
Not too far back. There it is. The olive shell, yeah. I kind of skipped over this. I thought it had a little bit more to go. This is the olive shell, Olivella biplicata. This is the one that the Chumash made a lot of their beads from. It has a deep, rich purple color, and they're quite common. They tend to be a little bit more subtidal sometimes, but and they live in the sand, and they've got this big foot that they kind of crawl around through there.
Were there any long-term studies done on the effect of the intertidal zone by the oil spills in the Santa Barbara Channel in the 1960s?
No, quite frankly. I mean, we've got the longest running intertidal monitoring going on, that started in about 1980, but it was actually designed originally to look at visitor impacts. Most of the impacts from oil were pretty much gone by that point. And we do get sort of a chronic oiling all the time, though, because of the natural seeps, and we see it quite a bit. I'm not sure what to say. That the organisms here seem to be able to tolerate it very well. That's all I can say. I think most of the impacts or the effects that we see, the differences, is probably because of people and trampling.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
They need to record it.
Sorry. Last night, Audubon had David Wishoff, who's been monitoring plastics, particularly for seabirds. But many of the pictures that he showed were beach areas covered with different types. None of your pictures really had any plastics. Is it true that you have less in the areas that you're monitoring, or is that just happened because the pictures didn't have it?
We actually don't find that much plastic in the rocky intertidal where I am most of the time. There's certain beaches that tend to accumulate it. We've done some marine debris surveys here in the past. We're not really doing any right now, but yeah, there's a lot of plastic out there still washing up on the beaches. But the ones that tend to accumulate it are the ones that are facing to the northwest at the west ends of the islands.
Okay, we'll take 3 more questions.
Hi, Dan. Have we been seeing any of the invasive kelp that we've been hearing about out at the Channel Islands? And if so, what kind of impact can it have or will it have?
Okay, there's 2 species that are pretty common, two kelp species. One is Undaria pinnatifolia, and that one we've got in the harbor here. We've actually got it on our docks. We need to keep vigilant and try and clean that off. The only place at the islands that we know that it occurs is out at Catalina Island, and oddly enough, it hasn't spread very far there. It's been really invasive in many parts of the world. Once it gets established, it really spreads. It's in all the harbors now along the mainland coast, but it hasn't moved out of that one spot on Catalina Island. There's another species, actually a couple of species of Sargassum. Sargassum muticum has been around for at least 40 or 50 years on the coast here, and it's just kind of gotten naturalized. It's fairly common, but it's not really become a real problem. But there's a new one called Sargassum horneri, and it has formed really dense thickets out at Catalina and San Clemente Islands. and we're real concerned about what it could do here. We've seen it at Anacapa. It's all over the place there. East end of Santa Cruz has a lot of it. We don't know how far west it's going to go. But so far, it hasn't gotten really, really thick here. It tends to die back in the wintertime, and so that may be an advantage here. It was a little bit colder than Catalina and San Clemente.
Hello? Hi, Dan.
Cedric.
Hey, how's it going? What about lichens? Do you see some lichens down in there in the intertidal area?
Yeah, there are some intertidal lichens. There are several species that are found on barnacle tests, and quite a few down on the rocks, just kind of in the high intertidal. I am not that familiar with them. I need to get out here with Kerry sometime and get him to describe, what's there. But yeah, there are several species that occur in the intertidal.
Okay, our last question for the night.
You mentioned the weathering foot disease with the black abs. Did that have much effect on your reds, your greens, and your pinks?
Yes, it did. Not as devastating as the black abalone, but it did affect them somewhat. We think the greens and probably the pinks were pretty heavily affected by them, actually. There was some concern about both those species and whether we should be looking at listing those as endangered, and look at some restoration projects possibly for them. But both of those seem to be have had a few good years recently, and they've been seeing some recruitment. Numbers are back up in some areas, and so there's not quite as much concern about it. Red abalone, we think we're knocked back a little bit. We certainly saw the disease impacting them, but to the extent that it was really lethal to them, that's not clear. We didn't have a study.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thanks everyone for coming tonight.
Thank you very much.
The next lecture will be on October 10th with Peter Sharp on bald eagle restoration and recovery. Thanks again. Have a wonderful night.